Hello and welcome to the Starting Necron series, the series in which we go from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list for the Necron faction. In this video we'll be taking a look at the HQ choices for the Necron forces. However, one thing I will clarify is we're only going to look at the generic HQ choices, as there are quite a few different HQ choices for the Necrons, and this video will be long enough with just the generic HQ choices. However, in a future video we will take a look at all the different named characters as well as the Silent King and give them their own time to shine. More so, when we discuss these units, the order they're presented in is how often they see play in tournament lists that do well within the events. And that's not to say that we're looking at them simply from a tournament perspective, but rather we're looking at tournaments to give us an idea of the power level of each unit, as that is the most objective and consistent way to grade power levels. All of the information that will be provided here is useful for casual games as much as anything else. The first HQ choice that has seen by far the most play within ranking tournament lists is the Chronomancer Cryptek unit. Crypteks are a rather strong unit as they're rather low cost and carry some rather powerful abilities, as well as offer various other perks in an army. One perk that can be used is if you have a Cryptek in your army and a Noble in your army, you can take a second Cryptek without taking up an HQ slot by using the Dynastic Advisor ability. This really lets you maximize the amount of Crypteks you can take within a list, though even without this ability, it's still rather easy to fit a couple different Crypteks within a list, as they have so much utility and their raw stats are rather good. And as such, the Chronomancer is not only the most popular Cryptek unit, but also the most popular HQ choice as a whole due to the abilities he has. So looking at the Chronomancer's base stats, he has a rather good mobility with 8 inches, rather good survivability with 4 toughness and a 4+ invulnerable save from the Time Splinter Mantle, and he comes with 4 wounds. So for 80 points, that's a rather good start. And if we continue looking at the Chronomancer, he comes with rather good weapon choices, with the Entropic Lance being the much better choice, as it has the same range as the Aeon Staff with better armor penetration damage and starts at strength 8, and that's a rather important breaking point in terms of strength when targeting different units, as it lets you wound on 2s against toughness 4 units, while wounding in 3s against units that are up to toughness 7, and this allows it to be a decent offensive weapon against mid-range targets as well as more armored targets. On the other hand, the Aeon Staff does have some perks that the Entropic Lance doesn't, as it has a D3 assault shot profile instead of just having assault 1, giving it an average of 2 shots, while also ignoring invulnerable saves. That being said, with a damage profile of 3 on the Entropic Lance in melee versus a damage profile of 1 on the Aeon Staff, as well as having a damage profile of D3+3 in shooting instead of 1, the Entropic Lance makes up for having fewer shots in shooting, and it costs the same as the Aeon Staff. So that seems a bit incorrect, because I would figure that the Aeon Staff would be a slightly lower cost option due to what it offers, but hey, as long as the Entropic Lance is the same price, you might as well pick up the Entropic Lance, to be honest. Also, the Chronomancer has a Chrono Tendrils ability, which gives him 3 extra attacks, as the model only has 1 base attack normally. The Chrono Tendrils don't have a great stat profile, as they're just the base attacks for the model with no modifiers to them, but as mentioned, the model only has 1 attack baseline, so this is a good way of adding extra attacks to the model without making it too powerful thanks to Entropic Lance. So it's a great way to split up attacks by giving it 1 very powerful attack and a few extra soft attacks so it doesn't get bogged down so easily in melee. Now when it comes to Crypteks, the biggest thing is they all have certain buffs that they give to your army, and the Chronomancer has an incredibly powerful one, which is called the Chronometron, and this buff is very good, as what it states is in the command phase you can pick a friendly dynasty unit within 9 inches, and they gain a 5+ invulnerable save and can reroll charge rolls. Both of those are good on their own, but together they're rather crazy when you can get both benefits in one unit. However, you don't have to make use of both the parts of that ability to make it good, as you can use one part at a time and still be completely fine, but when you do gain both, it's incredibly brutal. So when you consider that this unit has an Entropic Lance, a 4+ invulnerable save, and this powerful ability that I can give to other units for only 80 points, that's a really fantastic unit. Now, to punctuate why the Crypteks are so powerful, the list of stuff that they get actually continues beyond this, and the first thing Crypteks have are Arcana options, and what the Arcana is it's special war gear that the Crypteks can take, though the Arcana items do tend to be rather expensive, and as such they're a little more restrictive than something you would take always. There are 2 popular Arcana choices for the Chronomancer. The first of these is for 25 points you can get the Hypermaterial Ablator, and what it does is in your command phase you pick a friendly Dynasty Core or Canoptic unit within 9 inches, and until your next command phase, as long as it's more than 12 inches away from enemy attackers, it gains the Light Cover ability. So in other words, it gains +1 to the saving throw but not the invulnerable save. This can really allow the Chronomancer to provide one unit with a better save while also giving another unit an invulnerable save and charge rerolls by positioning between the 2 units, or simply really buff one unit to make that one unit incredibly hard to take out. It does drive up the cost though, but it's still something that can be rather good at times, though it can be rather hard to optimize because getting the Chronomancer in a position to give both buffs buffs within those 9 inches is a little tricky, though as mentioned, if you want to target one unit with both buffs, it becomes much easier to take full advantage of these abilities. Now, the second Arcana option is only 20 points, being the Prismatic Obfuscatron. It makes the Cryptek immune to being targeted with range attacks unless it's the closest eligible target, and this item is a lot more versatile than Lookout Sir, but a lot of the time you'll have the Chronomancer near other units due to the different buffs that he provides. Still, it can let the Cryptek with this item be very hard to damage while it positions itself more optimally, but as mentioned, the points on most of the Arcana items are somewhat high, so you really need to be going in with a game plan of how to take advantage of them if you do end up taking an Arcana. It's not one of those items you grab on a unit just as a point filler, because most of the time you do have options that are relevant for 20-25 points or even 30 points in some cases, and that's kind of the average cost of any of these Arcana. And as Crypteks are characters, they benefit from the different character buffs as well as stratagems, allowing them to take the extra heirloom or a warlord trait, which generally helps other Crypteks more than the Chronomancer, but it's still rather good on the Chronomancer. They also have the ability to potentially resurrect on a roll of 4+ for 1 command point. That's a rather mediocre ability, but if you want to coin flip and have command points, it's something you can definitely use to give them a little bit more longevity. Now, there's one other very important ability that all Crypteks have, and that is the Bound Creation ability. This brings us into a different unit that, although it's not an HQ choice, it does fit into the HQ slot due to how it functions. So in a position between first place and second place on the HQ choices are actually the Cryptothralls. These are an elite choice, but they're more of a Cryptek add-on, because if you have a Cryptek in your army, you can take a unit of these as a bound creation and they do not take up a unit slot, and each of these Cryptothralls cost 20 points each, and you need 2 of them if you're taking them as bound creations, because 2 is the maximum unit size, and this is why they're mostly only playable as a bound creation, because you don't want to be taking up an elite slot with just 2 of these units, though there are other reasons as well. To begin looking at the Cryptothralls, they actually have a rather good profile for how much they cost in terms of points, with a toughness of 5, a strength of 5, 2 wounds, and 3 attacks base, though only a 5-inch movement speed and only having a 3+ armor save, though that's not bad either, it's just kind of alright. Their melee weapons only have 1 armor penetration in terms of additional benefits, and they have a pistol weapon known as the Scouring Eye with a 12-inch range, and that's a rather long range for a pistol considering most are actually 6 inches, and not only that, but unlike most pistols, this actually has 2 shots at strength 5 and 2 armor penetration, and on top of all that, you can fire pistols within melee range, so that actually makes their power level go up a lot more than it first would seem. However, on top of all that, if they're within 6 inches of a Cryptek, they become enraged with Systemic Vigor, and when they do become enraged, instead of having a 4+ ballistic skill and weapon skill, they go to a 3+ weapon skill and ballistic skill, and their base attacks go up to 6. Comparing these to most similar units, they're rather undercosted, but the limited squad size really makes them limited to how many Crypteks you have, and that's not a bad thing as it makes the unit more interesting, though it does make the unit somewhat unplayable if you're not taking them as bound creations. More so, on top of all the benefits they gain from being near Crypteks and being taken alongside Crypteks, they can also protect Crypteks, as enemies can't target a Cryptek within 3 inches of a Cryptothrall with ranged weapons at all. They also qualify as canoptic units, which means they can even perform heroic interventions for 1 command point with the Enslaved Protector stratagem. They're really good, but as mentioned, they are limited to 2 models, and the elite slot has plenty of good units within it, so they are more of an HQ bonus to Crypteks as a result of this, though as mentioned, the Crypteks are some of the best units, and all 4 different types of Crypteks have access to these, so it's very easy to work these into your army, and considering they're actually rather low in points, you'll oftentimes see these in most armies, so in a weird way, these would actually take the number 1 slot, because even though an army list might not include a Chronomancer, it might include a different Cryptek, and that army list will usually include a couple of these as a bound creation for whatever Cryptek they do include. Coming in second place is the Catacomb Command Barge, a very unique model in terms of HQ choices, and looks great while also being great, and while it's the most expensive HQ choice of the generic choices, it's rather mid-range for what other armies and options offer on the high end of HQ choices when you look at the points value. Its profile is also incredibly strong for how much it costs, being very good at everything it does, and being sort of an army in one at only 150 points. Let's look at what the Command Barge offers. For the 150 points that you pay for the Command Barge, you get a fast-moving model at 12 inches with a 2+ ballistic skill and weapon skill, 6 toughness, 9 wounds, and a 3+ base save. A very solid profile with a lot of breakpoints in terms of stats that keep it within range of various special rules, while also making it incredibly hard to take out, and a very heavy-hitting unit. The Catacomb Command Barge comes with a couple different options in terms of ranged weapons. Normally it comes with a Gauss Cannon, and while you can save 5 points by downgrading the Gauss Cannon to a Tesla Cannon, the Gauss Cannon is well worth it for the higher damage and the armor penetration profile that it offers. Don't forget, this HQ choice is a vehicle and benefits from big guns never tire, so having a good shooting profile is relevant even in melee thanks to being a vehicle, which also makes it way stronger than it might first appear. In terms of melee options, it begins with a Staff of Light and has several other options, but none of which have a shooting profile. As a vehicle, the Staff of Light is very solid and can be upgraded to a Voltaic Staff, which is a more powerful relic version of the Staff of Light. As a vehicle, the shooting and melee profile also pull double duty, though one weapon option that replaces the Staff of Light might be relevant, being the War Scythe if you're running the Novak Dynasty and can access the Blood Scythe, though even then it's probably just a side grade at best and not an actual upgrade to the Staff of Light or the Voltaic Staff, and in some cases is probably even a downgrade simply because of that vehicle profile. Now when it comes to survivability, this unit has no issues being very tough to destroy while having a rather high output in terms of damage. On top of its normal profile, it has Quantum Shielding, which gives it a 5+ invulnerable save and ignores unmodified wound rolls of 1 through 3, no matter the strength profile of the weapon or what the weapon might have. In terms of other special abilities, it even has the option to go up to a 4+ invulnerable save for 1 command point using the Quantum Deflection stratagem, which is rather weak when you think about it, as all you're gaining is +1 to the invulnerable save for 1 command point, though as something to have that you can sometimes use, it's nice to know that it exists, I guess. Now with all the survivability that the Command Barge has, one thing that you can give it is the Warlord trait Enduring Will, as it makes it all the more durable, and that's actually a rather common tactic to give it that ability because of how strong it is already, and that makes it almost unkillable. With it being a character, it can always take an extra trait when needed, and as it's a 150 point model, you do want to protect it as much as possible, so that's always a good choice to go with. And with all of that, you also gain a slew of auras with things like My Will Be Done that lets you pick a Dynasty unit within 9 inches and give it +1 to hit during the attack phase. Following that ability, the Command Barge also has Relentless March that adds 1 inch to the move or advance of friendly core units within 6 inches, and gaining mobility is always a good thing to have. This can really help get Necron warriors and other core units onto objectives before the Command Barge goes off and joins a melee combat somewhere, and anytime you can gain a little bit more mobility, especially off of an aura like this that's on a character that you already want to take even if it didn't have this ability, that's an incredibly great bonus to have. Finally, the Catacomb Command Barge can take a Resurrection Orb, which allows you to trigger reanimation protocols on command, but it does cost 30 points and is a one-time use item, so that's a very steep investment when you can take something like the Cryptothralls with the Crypteks for slightly more points and gain a very powerful model on the table. It's definitely one of those items that's like the Arcana, which you need to have a game plan for if you wish to take, and not one you take as an extra bonus when you have points to burn. It's definitely playable in the right situations, but you definitely want to think about what you're going to do with it before you take it, as it's 30 points and you can definitely find ways to use those points otherwise. As a whole, the Command Barge is a very brutal unit that has a very high survivability, high damage output, and comes with a fast mobility that produces quite a few different buffs and auras. It's very much an intimidating sight to see on the table, and it's something that the opponents will have a hard time dealing with because of how strong it is, so it makes a lot of sense that this is in the second place of the HQ choices. Third place goes to the Technomancer, who is another Cryptek, but costs 75 points instead of 80 points like the Chronomancer does baseline, and the Technomancer has the same base stats as the Chronomancer, but only moves 5 inches baseline instead of the 8 inches of the Chronomancer. Though for only 5 points extra, the Technomancer can be given a Canoptic Cloak, which brings its movement up to 10 inches and gives it the fly ability, as well as the ability to repair D3 wounds on friendly Dynasty models within 3 inches at the end of the movement phase, so it's definitely an item you usually want to take with this unit because of how much mobility it adds, and the extra little perk of healing potential units, though the healing part is definitely less important than the mobility. Inversely, the Technomancer can take a Canoptic Control Node over the Canoptic Cloak, which gives it an aura that grants Canoptic models within 6 inches +1 to hit when they make attacks. At 15 points, this is a bit more fringe, while the Cloak is cheap and offers a ton of mobility, as well as healing side perks. So there are going to be situations where you want the Canoptic Control Node, but it's definitely going to be a lot rarer than the Canoptic Cloak itself. Unlike the Chronomancer, the Technomancer comes with a Staff of Light, which is about Aeon stuff outside of the ability to ignore invulnerable saves, but isn't as strong as the Entropic Lance. However, it can be swapped out with the relic Voltaic Staff, which is a pretty solid option and most likely brings it up to the power level of an Entropic Staff, though they are very different weapons in that sense. For the special ability Crypteks have, the Technomancer has Rites of Reanimation, which lets it choose a friendly Dynasty core unit within 6 inches and resurrect 1 model in that unit, or D3 models if they are Necron warriors. This can be a rather powerful ability, but opponents can play around it easily, although as Necrons like running large bunch units of Necron warriors, this can really put in some work, while the Technomancer itself has a rather decent profile to begin with. So it's not like you're investing in this ability alone like you are with many other characters that have similar abilities as this. More so, there is a stratagem which lets the Technomancer use Rites of Reanimation a second time for 1 command point using the Deathless Arise stratagem. Both instances happen in the command phase, and each unit can only be chosen once per phase, so it can be a little bit hard to set up, not only because your opponent will target a single unit until it's gone in most cases, but also because you need to be within a rather close range of 6 inches of both units when you're using this stratagem, though when you do get it off, you do get a lot of benefit for it. The Arcana options that are commonly seen on the Technomancer play into this as well though, with the Phylacteron Hive being a somewhat common choice, which for 20 points lets you choose a Canoptic, Destroyer Cult, or Praetorian once per game for Rites of Reanimation instead of a normal core unit like you're normally restricted to. Considering a Warrior is 13 points and a Skorpekh Destroyer is 30 to 35 points and is one of the lower points options for choices with those keywords, the capability of this Arcana reimbursing those 20 points isn't that hard. In many cases you can even come out ahead in points, but that can be a little bit tricky because remember, a lot of times your opponent is going to wipe out a squad before you get the ability to resurrect it. However, if you're in combat or something of that nature, it definitely becomes much easier to resurrect units. Another Arcana option that the Technomancer sees play with is the Failsafe Overcharger, which lets you select one friendly Canoptic unit within 9 inches and add 1 attack to the models in that unit. It's 30 points, so it's a rather steep cost, but it's definitely a rather powerful ability as it can increase the attacks enough of most Canoptic units to make up for the points rather quickly. Like most Arcana, you only take it with a game plan in mind, not just because you think it's cool. As a whole, the Technomancer is a solid unit that has a lot to offer, and unlike most resurrection-based units, it has a good enough profile in itself, so you're not stuck depending on bringing back enough units to make up for the point cost of the Technomancer itself, more so as it does want to target Necron warriors in most cases, and as Necron warriors are usually taking a block of 20 while having a rather good amount of survivability as it is, it has way more ability to have a high output, although there will be somewhat rare cases where the ability does nothing simply because your opponent is wiping out one squad at a time and not leaving enough units for you to be able to resurrect units. And to wrap up the Technomancer, don't forget it benefits from the Cryptek benefits, like being able to bring Cryptothralls as a bound creation, as well as dynastic advisors. Coming in 4th place is the Necron Overlord, and the Overlord isn't uncommon in armies, and for the most part is a low-cost Catacomb command barge that comes with a good bit of benefits, but is a much weaker unit overall. The biggest stat differences between the Overlord and the command barge is that the Overlord only moves 6 inches, only has 5 toughness, and only 5 wounds. The biggest drawback being that there's a lot more weapons that are strength 5 and can take advantage of that toughness 5 profile, and the lack of mobility is definitely a real bummer. Although in many cases you'll only pay 95 points for the Overlord because of the war gear options. For weapons, the Overlord is definitely less armed, starting with a Hyperphase Glaive, which is fine, and a Tachyon Arrow that is a very interesting weapon. It's a one-time use heavy hitting weapon and can be used to put out extra damage, but does cost you 5 points for that one-time use. If you like the Hunter Killer Missile or similar search weapons, it's not a bad choice and can be okay as a filler item because it definitely has an okay profile in most cases. Outside of that, the Overlord can pick a Void Scythe, which brings the Overlord's strength to 10, his armor penetration to 4, and each wound deals 3 damage as a result, but he does have -1 to hit while using the Void Staff. That's an incredibly powerful profile with 4 attacks that can break vehicles, though it does bring up the Overlord points to 110 points. However, that can still very well be worth it because of how much damage this item can do, as it does make the Overlord an incredibly heavy hitting unit. You can also take the War Scythe and upgrade it to a Blood Scythe if you're running the Novak Dynasty, or you can take a Staff of Light and bring it up to a Voltaic Staff, which will make the Overlord 95 points, making that the lowest costing option while being a rather powerful option at that. So while the Overlord isn't as powerful as the Command Barge, it's definitely a strong unit for its points and definitely a decent option if you don't have those extra 50 or so points to upgrade the Overlord to a Command Barge. Though if you do end up having an extra 50 points to throw around, which is somewhat of a rare occurrence, the Command Barge is definitely the correct way to go in terms of upgrades if you weren't sure which one you wanted to take. And like the Command Barge, the Overlord can pick up a Resurrection Orb and the Relentless March Aura and My Will Be Done powers. However, instead of Quantum Shields, the Overlord has a Phase Shifter, which gives him a natural 4+ invulnerable save, which does give him a slightly better invulnerable save than the Command Barge on a base level, oddly enough. In 5th place, we have the Royal Warden. This is a unit that surprised me in terms of how much play it saw in high-ranking lists. It's not bad, but it's definitely one that feels underwhelming for me when compared to different units like the Cryptek and the Overlord or Command Barge. For 75 points, it's not a bad unit and has some decent weapons, but it's a slow-moving unit at only 6 inches. The Royal Warden does have the Relentless March Aura and a Special Adaptive Strategy Aura, which allows you to pick a friendly Dynasty core unit within 9 inches in the command phase in order to allow them to fall back and shoot or charge. This is actually pretty solid, but does require you to be in close range range with a unit that's based around shooting, though it can help you make use of your shooting units, especially large blocks of Necrons that can fall back and blow things up with their rapid fire enabled, as they'll be within range of that ability. You can also increase the range of this aura with traits like Thrall of the Silent King, but that doesn't seem as good as other options overall, considering how good some of the Warlord traits can be for the Necron army. And in terms of relics, this is the only generic HQ choice that can use the Conduit of Stars, which isn't a bad option either if you're taking the Mephrit Dynasty and want something that gives you a little more shooting benefits while also taking the Royal Warden. As a whole though, it's a unit that's not bad, not great, kind of boring, but seems to be finding its place to some extent in lists that are doing rather well within tournaments. It's not as common as the previous choices, but it's not very fringe either, considering it does show up a decent amount, though the choices after this one are ones that are a lot more fringe and only show up on rare occasion, or not at all. But that's not to say that the following choices are unplayable, but probably that they're just a little weaker compared to some of the top choices, considering how stacked the Necron HQ choices actually are. In 6th place comes the Skorpekh Lord. I like the Skorpekh Lord model a lot, and I also really like the concept of what this model does, but it's a touch awkward in terms of where it fits into your army, as we'll soon see. For 130 points, you get a solid melee unit that has an 8-inch movement, 2+ weapon skill and ballistic skill, 6 strength and toughness, and 6 wounds, as well as 4 attacks baseline. For weapons, the Skorpekh Lord comes with an 18-inch range weapon that gets 2d3 assault shots at strength 6, so it can advance and shoot, making it get closer and closer to melee, while having a good shooting profile in terms of its ability to output damage on the advance roll. Once it's in melee, it has 2 weapon options, a Flensing Claw, which uses its base profile with 1 extra armor penetration, and for each attack the weapon makes 2 hit rolls, bringing up the base attacks to 8, so this is definitely a good option for clearing out larger swarms of units that don't necessarily have the highest toughness profile, though even mid-range units can be affected by this because of that strength 6, though with only 1 damage per attack, it's a little more situational against them. The second melee weapon it has is the Hyperphase Harvester, which brings its strength up to 8 and armor penetration of 4 with 3 damage per wound, but does give the wielder -1 to hit. This is a much better weapon to target stronger units with because of the high armor penetration and high damage, as well as reasonably high strength. Normally the -1 to hit isn't that big of a deal, considering you have a 2+ weapon skill to start with, so you're only hitting on a 3+ and doing incredibly devastating damage on those 4 attacks when you do manage to wound, and they fail a save because they're only taking an invulnerable save or a feel no pain save. This means that the Skorpekh Lord is rather good in combat against swarm units as well as tough targets. For additional abilities, the Skorpekh Lord comes with a 4+ invulnerable save, which is a nice bit of survivability, and the Hardwired for Destruction ability that lets him reroll hit rolls of 1 on a 2+ weapon skill that really reduces the few misses that he'll get. Finally, he comes with a unique aura that is called United in Destruction that gives friendly Dynasty Destroyer models within 6 inches the ability to reroll wound rolls of 1. This can be pretty good if he's in a unit of Skorpekh Destroyers, for example, which work great with him and look very thematic. Going down the road of survivability, he does have the option to use the Whirling Onslaught Stratagem, which for 1 command point gives enemies -1 to hit for the duration of phase, though as it can be used with Skorpekh Destroyers as well, it's probably better on them than it is on the Skorpekh Lord, due to Skorpekh Lord already having a decent amount of survivability versus the Skorpekh Destroyers, which are a little bit more fragile. As a whole though, the Skorpekh Lord exists in an awkward place because he's almost as many points as the Catacomb Command Barge, which is significantly stronger, and in terms of low cost options, the Overlord does it rather well. This doesn't make the Skorpekh Lord unplayable, as the Skorpekh Lord is still playable, but needs a lot more thought than the other options that fill the same niche. However, both Enduring Will and more importantly Honorable Combat are very good on the Skorpekh Lord, as he is a very solid melee threat and can pick a fight with other characters very easily and come out on top. Though there are limitations to this, he will have an easy time picking off enemy characters with that Honorable Combat trait, but then again so can the Overlord and the Catacomb Command Barge if they really wanted to. I would really like to see this model gain a little more individuality in terms of what it can do, as right now it's just a bit too similar to the other choices. It's not bad, it just needs a bit of something to take it to the next level, because right now it kind of falls in that awkward dead zone, because right now unless you're looking to spend that extra 30 points to go from an Overlord to a Skorpekh Lord, which isn't necessarily always an upgrade, you're generally going to probably take an Overlord, and if you have 20 points more than that, you're going to take the Command Barge. It's kind of not a great spot for him to be. Continuing on the theme of models that don't really fit anywhere, in 7th place is the Lokhust Lord. I would actually probably put this model a little lower on the list, but I figured I would talk about it now after the Skorpekh Lord. This model really confused me as it uses the chassis of a Lokhust Destroyer model, but functions as a melee unit and seems worse than a Skorpekh Lord or even an Overlord, even though it's only 105 points. It has the same movement profile as the Skorpekh Lord, but has 3+ ballistic skill and weapon skill, while also only having 5 strength, but otherwise is about the same as that Skorpekh Lord. At least it gets the Staff of Light, which can be upgraded to a Voltaic Staff, though all the other options it can take are melee options, which seem a little bit weak, and really puts the Staff of Light as the prominent option for this model. For abilities, the Lokhust Lord has a 4+ invulnerable save, just like the Skorpekh Lord and Overlord, and it has the Hardwired for Destruction ability as well as United in Destruction aura, which the Skorpekh Lord does have as well, though unlike the Skorpekh Lord it can take some special war gear such as the Phylactery that brings up the living metal healing to D3 instead of 1 for a total of 5 points. It can also take a Resurrection Orb, though we've discussed those and neither of those seem particularly great on it. However, it does move faster than the Overlord, which is something I guess, but it doesn't move that much faster than him. As I said, I don't get this unit because I like the Skorpekh Lord and think he needs a bit of a boost. However, when I look at the Lokhust Lord, it seems like an even more mediocre version of the Skorpekh Lord, and at the very best, it's probably a stand-in for the Overlord, as they are kind of similar in points with similar options, though most of the time I feel like I'd prefer an Overlord. However, I can see there being rare cases where the Lokhust Lord does make an appearance. When I first heard the name, I was really hoping this unit was a Ranger Lord that functioned as a gunline type unit, similar to the Locust Destroyers and Heavy Locust Destroyers, as it had a similar name and used a similar chassis as those models, though it seems like it ended up being just another melee character, which is rather sad as the HQ choices don't seem to have that much depth in terms of shooting characters. Maybe one day they'll at least make this a faster moving model, because at 8 inches, it does seem kind of slow when you compare it to something like the Skorpekh Lord. I don't see why it's not a faster moving unit, because it does have that hover platform underneath it, though maybe if they did make it faster, they would have to increase the points a little too much. I don't know, it just seems like a missed opportunity to make this model really stand out by either making it a ranged option or by making a fast moving Lord. In 8th place, we have the Plasmancer, which is another Cryptek, and as such you'll probably see more play as time goes on due to having a lot of options that all of the Crypteks gain access to. The Plasmancer has the same stats as the Technomancer without upgrades, but comes with the Plasmic Lance, which is a weaker Entropic Lance overall, but not terrible as you're only paying 70 points for the entire model. And as far as abilities go, the Plasmancer is a living lightning rod with 2 abilities that really showcase it pulsating energy out at all times, with the first ability being Living Lightning, which says at the start of the fight phase, you roll a d6 for every enemy model within 6 inches, and on a 4+, the unit it belongs to suffers 1 mortal wound. That can be a rather powerful ability, as the Plasmancer doesn't need to be in combat and can be positioned to do some damage to multiple units. It's definitely a good start to the abilities, but let's see what the other ability does as well. The second ability that the Plasmancer has is the ability called Harbinger of Destruction, and what the Harbinger of Destruction does is at the end of your movement phase, if the Plasmancer didn't fall back, it rolls 3d6, and the closest enemies within 24 inches that are visible suffer 1 mortal wound each on a 4+. This is a ranged mortal wound ability that stacks with the previous one, and while it's a rather small amount of mortal wounds that are hard to control, it's definitely a fine mini bonus in terms of what it can do. With that being said, this is all the unit really does, besides what other Crypteks can already do themselves. It can definitely be an interesting mortal wound generator, as mortal wounds are rather nice to have, but it's much harder to use than the previously mentioned Crypteks. I can see this rising in ranks as time goes on and people figure out how to optimize the abilities that it provides as mortal wounds become more prominent, though at the same time, if more counters to mortal wounds do start coming out, this can definitely fall down the list as well. However, it's already kind of low on the list, and even as a Cryptek, you're usually going to be picking either a Chronomancer or a Technomancer above it. In 9th place, we have the Psychomancer, which is the final Cryptek option on the list, and he has all of the Cryptek benefits that all of the other Crypteks have, and we've already discussed. The Psychomancer hasn't seen any high level play so far, but isn't particularly bad at 70 points and brings some reasonable abilities to the table. However, the Chronomancer and the Technomancer are very strong, and multiples of those can still be very good, so you're usually going to see just several Chronomancers with maybe 1 Technomancer, and you're generally not going to see the Plasmancer or the Psychomancer at this time. So let's see where the Psychomancer falls short in terms of options. To begin, the Psychomancer is armed with an Abyssal Lance, and it's a rather mediocre item compared to the Staff of Light or the Entropic Lance or even the Plasmic Lance, so as a whole he's already starting on the back foot just with the weapon he carries. And as a Cryptek he comes with special abilities, and in this case he has 2 different special abilities, the first being the Nightmare Shroud aura, which gives enemies within 6 inches -1 leadership and subtracts 1 from their combat attrition tests. The second ability is a bit stronger, and it's the Harbinger of Despair ability, and what it says is in your moral phase, you can select an enemy unit within 12 inches, and you roll 3d6. If you happen to beat their leadership on that roll, you pick one of the following debuffs and apply it to them until your next moral phase. The first of the debuff options is that they cannot perform actions, and if they're performing an action, it automatically fails. The second is that the enemy unit loses objective secured. The third is that any charges or advance rolls made by that unit are halved, and the final and fourth one is they cannot fire Overwatch and they fight last in combat. These are all actually rather fine abilities, but the 12-inch range and the 5-inch movement speed of the Psychomancer makes it hard to efficiently target these consistently, as a lot of times you'll find that you use one ability and then you're out of range to use another one when you really want to use it. More so, the objective secured part can be very strong, but Necrons tend to be very good at objective secured as it is, meaning it's mostly beneficial for mirror matches, so that kind of falls off as well, though there definitely can be times outside of mirror matches where you do find use from it. The charge debuff is probably the weakest one, as it seems good in theory, but in reality you have to be 12 inches away from the unit to use it, so if they make their normal move of 6 inches or whatever it is and then make a charge roll, they'll probably end up charging anyway, so it does seem like kind of a dead ability. However, maybe sometimes you'll be able to keep a unit from charging a different unit that's further away, but even then it seems a bit mediocre. And as a result of all of this means that the fight last ability is probably going to be the most consistent, as it's the one that you're most likely going to be within 12 inches of anyway. However, is it really worth it as opposed to taking a different Cryptek? I'd probably say it isn't, and I would say the biggest issue with this unit is the fact that the range and movement speed are rather low. Despite it having a rather good set of abilities, that can be incredibly powerful in terms of swinging victory score, though because they're all kind of niche and it's such a limited range, you're definitely going to have a hard time making use of all of them. The one nice thing I can say though is that with 3 dice, on average you're going to be rolling a 10 or 11, and that makes it rather easy to beat most leadership scores, so I guess that's a bit of a silver lining at least. Though I don't know, maybe there will be some situations where the Psychomancer is good, because again, he still is a Cryptek, he still has pretty good abilities. It's just a question of, does he really ever make the cut? I think he's going to have a really hard time showing up in the top tournament lists, but there's definitely some potential for him to do so, and I'm not going to rule him out completely. And wrapping up the generic HQ choices, in 10th place is the Necron Lord. The Necron Lord is one of the lower costing HQ choices, but doesn't seem to have a home unless you're really tight on points and want to model like the Overlord but can't afford him in terms of points. Let's look at it this way. If an item existed that gave the Necron Lord +1 weapon skill, +1 ballistic skill, +1 wound, +1 attack, and a 4+ invulnerable save for only 25 points, would you take it? If you said yes, then generally you'll prefer the Overlord, who comes with all of that for only 25 points more when armed with a Staff of Light. Both the Necron Lord and the Necron Overlord have the Relentless March aura, but the Lord has the Lord's Will that lets you pick one friendly Dynasty core unit within 9 inches and reroll ones to hit, while the Overlord has My Will Be Done, which adds 1 to the attack hit roll for chosen units. It's an okay ability, but most armies have an aura that mimics this ability and affects all units within a certain range as opposed to specifically targeting one unit, and those auras usually come in a character that costs about the same amount of points or even less in some cases, so it's definitely a bit underwhelming when you consider you have to target one unit with it as opposed to giving it to everyone. So in conclusion, the Necron Lord can definitely be played, but will generally lose out to other options as he's about the same cost as a Cryptek or Royal Warden, which do a little more for the same amount of points. Maybe if he has a lot less points he would see some use as a filler HQ, but the Necron HQ choices are incredibly stacked and in most cases are very powerful and well worth the points spent on them. So it's incredibly hard to find space for something like the Necron Lord, especially when you have all these other great options. Anyway, if you've enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe as it really does help the channel out, and if you think someone would benefit from either this guide or another one of the army guides that I made, do share the videos as it helps other players out. And as always, thank you for watching and have a great day. Bye.